Okay, now it's time for one of my favorite lessons, spelling variations in German genealogy. As many of you who have worked with genealogical documents will know, spelling was very fluid in the past. That's because there was really no standardization until the late 19th century. So that means that our ancestors and scribes often spelled words, particularly last names, like they sounded to their own specific ears. So that means you as a researcher might run into a lot of variations of your last names and various other words throughout your documents. So how are you supposed to recognize all those variations? Well, luckily, there are certain patterns that these creative spellers tended to follow. So if they didn't write it one way, they likely wrote it another. So that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson, how to recognize those different variations and know if your name that you're seeing in the record really is the last name of your ancestor or a totally different last name belonging to someone else. So let's jump right in. So these four-letter pairs are the most commonly switched letters in German. Even today, when students, young children, are learning to write, they will often confuse one of these sounds for the other. And that is because B and P, for example, are made at the exact same part of our mouth as each other. So if you're at home right now, make a B sound. Now make a P sound. Can you feel and even see on my own mouth how they're both made at the front of the mouth in the same part? The difference between these two letters is that the B is voiced. Our vocal cords vibrate when we make a B sound, whereas the P is voiceless. Our vocal cords do not vibrate. And that's the same for all of these letter pairs. The column on the left are voiced. The column on the right is voiceless, but each of these pairs is made at the same part of the mouth as its counterpart. So what does that mean for you as a genealogist? Well, what it means is if your last name has one of these letters in it, for example, a P, look for it with a B as well. If your last name has a G in it, look for it with a K. If it has a T in it, look for it with a D, V, F, etc. To give you an example, I actually got married in both Austria and America, and Austria was our first wedding. It was in German, and my maiden name was Portnoy, Portnoy. And my mom, the whole time over there, was just laughing so hard because instead of calling me Catherine Portnoy, they kept calling me during the entire wedding ceremony, Katerina Bortnoy. Even though he was seeing a P, he was pronouncing it with a B. Because even today in German, they really mix up these sounds and they don't sound very different to a German speaker's ear. So if somebody in 2014 could have been calling my Portnoy last name Bortnoy, you can imagine in the 1700s or 1800s that these sounds and these spellings were getting switched for each other all the time. So this is the most important slide in this entire slideshow. Take a screenshot of it, save it for your records, and make sure to look for the different letter pairs when you're researching your ancestor's last name. Another spelling variation you might see is this SZ for either a double S or an S. So this SZ makes an S sound, which means it was often substituted for a SS or an S by itself. You may see it in words such as das. So remember, we talked about das being the word for the. In the past, you might see that word das written with an SZ instead of just an S. Doesn't change the meaning, just an alternate spelling. You might see was with an SZ instead of an S. So that word means what or which. You might see the word dessen. This is a good word to know in German genealogy, and I don't know if I've mentioned it yet. This word dessen will be seen in the phrase und dessen Ehefrau. Do you remember what Ehefrau means from our lesson previously? I think it was in our family lesson, perhaps. Ehefrau means wife. So und dessen Ehefrau means and his wife. So you'll often see that phrase after a man's name. So Johann Schmidt und dessen Ehefrau Anna Schmidt and his wife. So today that word dessen is spelled with a double S. But in the past, sometimes you might see it with this S set as well, and it doesn't change the meaning. Lassen, remember how we talked about taufen lassen, to have baptized? So the word lassen means to allow, to let, or to have done. A lot of times in genealogy, we are using the phrase taufen lassen, meaning to have baptized. And that word lassen today is spelled with a double S. In the past, you might see it with an S set. Another variant in spelling you might see is either a C or a CK, where a K would be today, which oftentimes makes the German word look more like our English word today. So for example, in German today, the month of October, if you'll remember, is spelled with a K, but as you go farther back in time, you might actually see it with a C on your German records. So that makes it even easier to recognize for us English speakers. You might see Kapitän with a C instead of a K for the word captain, again, making it look more similar to our own English word. Or katholisch with a C instead of a K for Catholic, making it look more like our word Catholic. Now, this one I mentioned in a previous lesson, but we haven't gotten into it yet, and this is so important. In the past, you might see an extra H in words that is no longer in words today. For example, remember that the word verheiratet means married. In the past, you might see an extra H right there after the T. So this TH in German doesn't make a th sound. In fact, they're not very good at doing the TH in German. But that's okay. Not all Americans are good at doing umlauts. So we all have our strengths and weaknesses in language. But they don't say TH. They just would still pronounce this verheiratet. So both words would be pronounced the same. And this H doesn't really make a difference to the pronunciation. But in the past, it might have been added in the spelling. So this is important to know because if you're trying to look up a word in a dictionary that has an extra H and you can't find it, take out that H and I bet you'll find it then. Tun, this word T-U-N, means to do. In the past, there might have been an extra H thrown in there. Monat, this one comes up a lot in genealogy. As you know, today it's spelled like this, but in the past, it might have had an extra H at the end and it wouldn't have changed the pronunciation. Paten, this is a very important one in genealogy, comes up a lot on church records. Today is spelled P-A-T-E-N, but in the past, sometimes the farther back you go, there'll be an H after that T. So you don't want to be looking up Pathin in the dictionary, even though they would have pronounced it Patin as well. You want to take out that H and look that up instead. So like I said, if you're trying to find a word and you can't find it with that H, remove it. Remember, it's an old-fashioned spelling, and perhaps your word is one such instance of that extra H appearing. Other variations you might see are a double F instead of just an F. This is especially common in towns that end in Dorf. So D-O-R-F means village. And sometimes in the past, you would see village written with a double F. So you might get the town ending in Dorf, either with a single F or a double F. And if you can't find it with a double F on a map, don't worry. Remember, that's just an old-fashioned spelling. It probably only has one F today. It will still be the same town. Some additional examples are auf, the preposition, meaning in or on. So you might see that with two Fs instead of one. getauft, our favorite word. I feel like that's the most popular word in this course right now. You might see that here again with 2 F's instead of 1, meaning baptized. Or along those lines, taufe, meaning baptism, written with 2 F's instead of 1. Again, that double F doesn't change the pronunciation, but it's especially important in towns because I don't want you thinking, oh, my town on this record has 2 F's, but the town on Google Maps only has 1. That must be a different town. Very unlikely. That double F is very likely an old-fashioned spelling. Another old-fashioned spelling is DT instead of T. And this gets more common the farther back in time you go. So more 1700s rather than 1900s. You might see the word tot, T-O-D-T, instead of T-O-T for the word dead. So again, this D is almost silent. It really doesn't change the pronunciation of the word, which is why they sometimes wrote DT instead of T. This one is really old-fashioned. I'd say more 1600s. Und with a DT on the end instead of just und for and. So that's not a different word. That's just an old-fashioned spelling of the word und or and. And then again, this is another very old-fashioned one, ET for T. So remember how we talked about in the past, how many verbs, past tense verbs, will just end with T. So for example, the verb lachen becomes gelacht, laughed, or the verb kochen becomes gekocht, cooked. But in older documents, you might see an E inserted here. So gelacket, gekocht. One of the most common ones you'll see in German genealogy is instead of the word gezeugt, which means conceived, you might see gezeuget. So that would be a lot of times if the father wasn't known at the birth, there might be a notation on the side saying the father appeared before me on this date and said the child was gezeugt or gezeuget by him. The child was conceived by him, thus letting them know who the father of the child was at a later date. G for CH is something, this is both old-fashioned and appears in people's letters who may not have been very educated. If any of you have ancestors, Germans from Russia, for example, not trying to insult anybody's ancestors, but the Germans from Russia as a whole did not have as much formal education, at least based on their writing, and their spelling was very, very, very creative. Whenever I'm translating any letters from Germans from Russia, I almost have to like turn off my brain and just try to let myself absorb the words and think, what could they mean? Because they really did get creative in how they spelled words. But that G for CH appears in a lot of their letters and in a lot of old-fashioned documents as well. So you may see verliebt instead of verlicht. So in the word married, having that G replace the CH. The word nicht, meaning not, you may see NIGT instead of CH. And again, this is more common in letters where people did not have as much formal education or far, far back in the past. This one is really far back in the past. I've only seen this in the 1600s and before, and that is an I for a J at the beginning of words. So you may see Jahr. I don't even know how to pronounce that. I'm guessing the same as Jahr, meaning year. So you might see that written with an I instead of a J. The word jetzt, if you'll remember, means now. Today spelled with a J, sometimes seen with an I way back in the 1600s. And that's it for our consonants. So now we want to get into vowels because there were some variations in the vowels as well.